We're going to continue our conversation on the crisis in Ukraine. Joining us from the Truman Project, he's a fellow there, is Job Henning. We heard the Ukrainian president say security forces are helpless. You're a watcher. You've been watching this area for a long, long time. Are you surprised how quickly the events have kind of spiraled out of control?
Well, Mike, I'm surprised about how far things have gone. I'm not necessarily surprised by the fact he says those forces are helpless, because the reality is Russia's been in strategic control in an indirect way throughout much of eastern Ukraine for several weeks, if not longer. And I think the ability of the Kiev government to project force in those areas was always in question. So no, I'm not terribly surprised. I am surprised how it kind of all came to a head so suddenly, though.
He uses the word helpless for the security forces. There's this view that perhaps the central government itself is somewhat hapless. They don't really seem to know what to do. They don't seem to be moving rather quickly. What's your gauge on how well is the government doing there?
I think if you look at his comments earlier today in Ukrainian, they were translated a little more plainly, but in Ukrainian, he was speaking, frankly, honestly, we don't have control over our country. And I think you have a new level of candor coming from the leadership in Kiev. I think, on the other hand, it's important to realize this is exactly what President Putin in Russia has sought. He sought to sow doubt on the viability of that Kiev government. That government it was always a long shot that government was going to be able to hold together a coherent, integrated Ukraine. And now you have that government itself admitting that it doesn't control its own sovereign territory.
We saw the protests in the Maidan, and things kind of got stirred up and everything kind of unraveled rather quickly. Should the West have been prepared for this? I mean, should they have positioned things differently? Should they have given an economic lifeline to Ukraine earlier? Should things have been done differently, perhaps?
Well, Mike, it's a legitimate question. I think a couple of things. I think on the lifeline, no. I don't think Ukraine was in a situation that it would have benefited from that sort of money. I think the level of corruption, the lack of reforms, money into that country at that point really wouldn't have done a lot. And a lot of money, of course, was put into Ukraine. I do think, though, two things. People say this is a new development in Russian foreign policy, and certainly in terms of magnitude and scale, it is. But I think it's important to look at 20 years of Russian foreign policy throughout its near abroad. Russia simply has not accepted the idea of a Russian nation state. It still has a post-imperial identity, and it feels it can win if others lose in its perimeter. It's done it in Georgia. It's done it in South Ossetia in Georgia, in Abkhazia. It's done it in Transnistria in Moldova. This is part of a long pattern behavior. So in that regard, I do think the West should not have been as surprised. And the last thing is, I think it is important to look at the tug of war that was set up over that trade agreement, and that certainly could have been done differently, and Secretary Kerry has said as much recently.
Well, and you talk about this long pattern, and yet it seems to me, if you look at the playbook, this is the long pattern of the Cold War. Russia does something, the U.S. does something, the West does something. And it seems like, in many respects, Ukraine's kind of lost in this whole argument. We slap them with sanctions. Is NATO being too provocative? Ukraine doesn't seem to figure in the conversation with a lot of folks.
Well, I think that's certainly Putin's intention, and certainly he's created a strategic environment where that's more likely to occur. I think it's important to resist that. I think the European Union and the U.S. have worked hard to resist that. They spent a lot of time in Kiev, a lot of support for that government. I think at the end of the day, though, everybody does have to focus on the fact this is not about the Cold War. It's a very, very different context. You have a very weak state, Russia, that's able to cause a lot of commotion and draw a lot of attention to itself, but it is simply not the same strategic situation.
We're running out of time. I want to ask you about the May election. What does this mean for the May election?
I think the May election is in great jeopardy, and I think, I hope that people are seriously considering alternatives for the scheduled election. I think to the extent Putin can cast doubt on the validity of that election, he's going to create an even weaker government in Kiev. That is his intention by all accounts. Allowing the election to proceed under the current circumstances, I think, is highly risky.
All right. Thanks so much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Certainly appreciate it. Great to see you again.